All in My Life, Jack Gantos. Page 72.
Chapter 2, On Voyage. Before Hamilton and I set out on the final journey, we took several practice voyages, and each one was disastrous in regard to seamanship and companionship. If I hadn't been so spellbound by the thought of $10,000 in cash, I would have fled with the rats the moment the rust-colored sails were hoisted, because it was obvious that we didn't so much arrive at our destinations as aim and crash into them, like kamikaze yachtsmen. On our first practice, we couldn't even get out of the harbor without shaming ourselves in front of the entire boating community. We were in high spirits when we set off, so we had the Beaver in full sail, the main and mizzen and jib smartly trimmed for all to see as we lumbered toward the channel through the reef which outlined the harbor. I was down in the main cabin opening a couple of cold beers for a mid-morning toast when a crash and a sudden pitch to starboard had me panicked. I could hear the brittle stagboard coral snapping off against our bows as the sail dragged us up and onto a reef. I dropped the beers and scrambled up the ladder to the main deck. Instead of steering between the port and starboard buoys, marking the deep channel through the reef, Hamilton steered to the outside of the port marker. Now he stood at the wheel and scowled at me as if I had charted the course. "Don't just stand there," he barked. "Lower the sails." I hurried to get them down before we did any further damage to the hull. For all I knew, we would sink. As I lowered the main, the keel struck a solid wall of coral heads, and we heaved forward and came to a grinding stop. I flopped awkwardly onto the deck. "Idiot," Hamilton shouted. "Get up, you're making a fool of us." "Don't blame me," I snapped. "Don't you dare talk back to the captain," he snapped. "Now get to work." Then he went below and didn't return. "Remember the money," I muttered angrily to myself. The money. While I secured the sails, I began to realize why he ducked out of sight. Boats passed out of the harbor and into the harbor, and each one slowed to remark on my sail and gaff and give me advice. It was clear that we had to sit there like wooden carrion until, if we were lucky, high tide would float us off. 4 hours later, it did. Hamilton returned from the and raised the sail. "Take the wheel," Hamilton ordered, "and head for the Buck Island beach. I'm going to check the hull." Buck Island was a small island just off the northeast coast of St. Croix. Before the racial trouble started, hundreds of tourists sunbathed there, and it was especially popular with scuba divers who could follow an underwater park trail through the coral on the east side. Now it was mostly deserted. I aimed for the sandy west side. The wind was behind me and the mainsail was full out. The boat cruised along. Down below, I could hear Hamilton knocking about, lifting boards and looking for leaks. It occurred to me that I knew nothing about survival at sea. The only common sense facts I knew were to get a life raft, have protection from the sun, and plenty of fresh water, and drink your own urine when you run out of fresh water, because salt water will certainly kill you. My father had thought to teach me this after he had been in a sailing accident and stranded on a life raft for 2 days. When Hamilton emerged, he said the hull was fine, then checked the trim of the sails. He frowned at me as he pulled the main in a bit and tightened the jib. I just kept moving the wheel a little to the left and a little to the right, pretending that my small adjustments actually made a difference. Hamilton stretched out on the deck and closed his eyes. "Wake me when we get there," he said. I just stared at the huge mainsail and kept the wind behind us. I didn't want it to start luffing or Hamilton would hop up and get after me. In the few days we had spent outfitting the Beaver, checking the ropes, repairing sails, sealing the deck, he treated me like Billy Budd. I couldn't do anything right, and he just glowered at me like Claggart when I made a stupid mistake. I was thinking about what it was going to be like spending a month on board with him, when suddenly I noticed we were rapidly closing in on the island, and we were still under full sail. "Hamilton," I shouted, "get up." I spun the wheel hard to port and began to lower the main, but it was too late. Our momentum took us directly toward the beach. We ran aground, softly, onto the sand. Only the bow was stuck, like a knife in a rum cake. A few locals ran toward us, laughing and shaking their heads in disbelief. We were the Keystone Cops of the sea. I waved back to them and grinned. Hamilton was furious. "This is an outrage," he said. "You made a fool of us again." Then Keel haul me, I barked back. Don't tempt me, Hamilton said coldly. Keel hauling is still legal in the British Navy. Then he ducked down the hatch, and in a minute the motor started and he shifted the boat into reverse. The sea beneath our stern bubbled up, but the screw didn't generate enough torque to pull us out. Finally, one of the idle tourist boats edged up alongside our stern, and the captain tossed me a lanyard. I tied it to a cleat, and he towed us off the beach. Thanks, I shouted, when we'd been set loose. I untied the lanyard and let it drop to the water. Any time, the skipper called back, and I could make out his sly smile as he deftly coiled the rope. 2 days later, we left St. Croix for good. We set out at night in calm water with our lights off and followed the channel markers north out of the harbor, past Buck Island, and farther towards St. John and Virgin Gorda. When I turned to say goodbye to St. Croix, I could see 2 warehouses burning down at the docks. The white exodus was even more frantic now. Already those who could see the writing on the wall were torching their own property for the insurance money before it became worthless. The flames illuminated a small city of wooden crates that had already been packed with personal goods and prepared for shipping. But I was filled with joy and triumph, and the fires to me were the flames of Troy still burning as Odysseus pushed off for Ithaca. I was ready for adventure. It was not lost on me that so many great writers had gone to sea, and for them, setting off to cross the water was the same as setting down to fill the pages with their adventures. Before leaving, I'd gone to a used bookstore and selected every title I could find which had something to do with the sea. I had Billy Budd, Martin Eden, Treasure Island, Heart of Darkness, The Odyssey, Robinson Crusoe, and the Mutiny on the Bounty trilogy. I figured these books would have to live with me as cabin companions, since Hamilton was so snappish. But I didn't mind. I wanted to write while sailing, and I was more than willing to come under the spell of books. All through the first night, Hamilton took the wheel because only he knew where the hash was buried. At dawn, I was asleep in the aft cabin when suddenly I was thrown out of my bunk and onto the floor. I could hear Hamilton cursing on deck. The ropes were slapping the mast and the boom was tangled in the stanchion ropes. I slipped on my topsiders and went up. By then Hamilton had the gaff and boom under control, and I pulled down the jib. "What happened?" I yelled into the wind. "Riptide," he hollered back. "Not to worry." Riptide my ass, I thought. I figured he had fallen asleep but wouldn't admit it. I looked around.